Today, I'm going to rank every Red Dead Redemption 2 antagonist in a tier list, starting from the worst antagonist and going all the way up to the best antagonists. 99% of my viewers are unsubscribed, so if you'd like to see more content like this, subscribe, as I'll be posting tier lists every single day. In last place, I've got Joe. Joe is not really a major antagonist in the story. He's just Micah's friend, but he does help everyone turn against John and Arthur in the last chapter, so I think it does kind of help to have him as an antagonist. He's also not really in the story at all. At least Cleve is in the final bank or the final train robbery, because Cleve is actually kind of talking to Arthur and hanging out with him. And I feel like Joe doesn't have any lines of dialogues besides this part in American Venom where he does eventually get shot and killed. So I think he has to be the worst antagonist in the entire game. He's not really involved in it at all, and I just don't really think he plays a big enough role to put him any higher than F tier. In 11th place, I've got Alberto Fusar. I think Fusar is an interesting character. He's definitely the biggest guy in Guarma, the big bad guy in Guarma, but he's not really an antagonist to me. He has the same vibes as Cornwall, where it's like the big bad guy that you have to take out once you take out all the goons, but he doesn't have any big bad guy like vibe like Cornwall does, and he doesn't really seem like this guy that they all have to get. Of course, the Leon and his friends, like all the revolutionaries, they hate Fusar, but I just don't think he plays a big enough role, and especially when he's considered a major character and definitely the major antagonist of chapter 5. I don't think he plays a big enough role in that to actually be warranted any higher of a role, and I just think there's no development with him. He just seems like this big bad guy that you don't even get to kill in an interesting way. You have to shoot him with a cannon, or you can snipe him or whatever. There's no cutscene for that. At least this Mexican standoff here is kind of interesting, but I feel like the rest of the game is just kind of boring, and they don't build up Fusar to be a big enough, bad enough character to really warrant him being the major antagonist of chapter 5, and I think they really underdeveloped him, and I think that was part of the game, though. Like, they wanted to do more with Guarma, but they weren't able to. Like, you used to be able to go to Guarma and do stuff after the fact, but I think they had to cut some of that. So that kind of has to hurt him a little bit because they didn't develop him enough. But I think Fusar is just way too underdeveloped for a character that is a major antagonist of a full chapter. So I'm going to have to put him in F tier. In 10th place, I've got Cleve. Cleve at least is a little bit more developed with Joe, as he has some interactions with Arthur, and he does have that interaction where you actually finish him off and send him back to hell. But I think Cleve is at least a little bit more interesting than Joe, and while I don't think he's very fleshed out of a character, I think he's more fleshed out than even someone like Fusar is, which is so weird to say. But yeah, even though Cleve doesn't really play a big role in the game, he just kind of plays the same role as Joe does, where he just kind of backs up Micah. It is kind of interesting to see how he left the gang after Micah supposedly killed an innocent little girl, and he actually maybe changed his ways before he died. Either way, Sadie did the right thing on killing him, but I think he at least has a little bit more development than someone like Joe or even Fusar has, and I'm going to have to put him in D tier because of that. In 9th place, I've got Agent Ross. Agent Ross is an interesting character just because he does play a much larger role in Red Dead Redemption 1 than he does in Red Dead Redemption 2, but he's just kind of like this background pet character to Milton, and I feel like he doesn't have any actual talking scenes. There are a couple where he actually does talk, but I feel like he's just Milton's sidekick the entire time, and he doesn't actually have any character development of his own, but you can kind of see how much he starts hating the people, and it really goes to shape his character in Red Dead Redemption 1, and I think that's a really great thing that Rockstar did. They had all the things he did in Red Dead Redemption 2, just being Milton's sidekick and kind of seeing how Milton treated all these people and then realizing, oh, that's not how you treat gangsters, and that really played into his role in Red Dead Redemption 1, but since I can't really consider that here, in Red Dead Redemption 2, he has to be a C tier antagonist. In 8th place, I've got Lee Gray. Lee Gray is, I don't know, a weird character because he kind of seems like your friend at some points. You're supposed to like him, you're supposed to be friends with him as a sheriff, but he's just kind of this drunken guy and he doesn't really do much. But he's like the main head of the Gray family when it doesn't really seem like he's that. It just seems like someone else runs the family, but he's just kind of the main actor here. And I think that's kind of what takes him away from being as good as Miss Braithwaite, who I think is a lot better than him, just because she's actually the main person in the family and everyone else runs it for her. But Lee Gray is just kind of another guy in the family, and he doesn't really run the family, but I guess he's the one that's mainly seen as the talking piece between the family and the Van der Linde gang, and that's why he becomes the villain here. But there's not really much like growth to be had here, and I don't think Lee Gray does much or does enough to actually put himself as any higher of a character than C tier. So I'm gonna have to put Lee Gray in C tier. He doesn't really do much, and he's just kind of the sheriff in Rhodes that doesn't do much, and then you eventually kill him, and doesn't like I didn't feel anything when I actually killed him. In 7th place, I've got Angelo Bronte. Angelo Bronte is pretty cool. I mean, you see him as like the kingpin of Saint Denis, and he seems like he's super clever guy. Like he knows how to play. He sees through the Van der Linde gang's act, and he like sees through their stick. But at the same time, this is a guy who's like really a coward. He's hiding in his bathtub all the time, and he doesn't seem like a guy that is really that scary to me. And while he does run everything, he just kind of runs everything because he's super rich and he already ran the criminal gangs before it. And as soon as he does die, Guido Martelli easily takes over and just kind of takes the same role that Bronte does. So I think that takes it down a little bit for me. But at least Bronte is a guy that can see through the Van der Linde gang stuff. And that makes him a way more interesting antagonist. Of course, also the fact that he does take care of Jack Marston well. And he's like nice to Jack Marston, does put him up a little bit in my books. At least this is a guy that's nice to the people that they want to kind of intimidate, and just he really just, I don't know, has an interesting aura around him, just being the super rich guy. But I don't think he has enough of an antagonist force, and he doesn't last long enough in the game to really be any higher than B tier. But I still think he is a really, really solid antagonist, and I do like the way they developed him. In 6th place, we have Catherine Braithwaite. She's kind of a mix between Angelo Bronte and Gray, where she's from this like rich family, but she's more cunning, similar to Angelo Bronte. And I feel like just the whole development of her character works really well and is kind of interesting because she, is this old woman who's like, really cunning and really smart and kind of understands and sees through the Van der Linde gang stuff. She tries to use them first, but then when she sees that the Greys are also using them, she eventually just stops, and they both kind of turn on the Van der Linde gang with her kidnapping Jack Marston and then eventually shipping him off to Angelo Bronte, which is also another genius idea by her. So I just think she's a really smart and interesting antagonistic character, and I think the way they developed her was really interesting because it seemed like, oh, you can just scam these rednecks out of anything, but then it was like, oh, Catherine Braithwaite's actually a really smart woman, and even though she's kind of like this old, frail woman, and you eventually do get to kill her and take her out, and I feel like that's probably one of the most fun missions of the entire game, maybe even the best mission of the entire game. It's so fun to do all these things, and while I don't think she's developed as well as some of these other characters, just because she isn't in the game as much, she's only in Chapter 3, and you don't get to really interact with her much. She's a really good character, and that's why I'm going to have to put her in B tier. She's a really cunning character and really smart, but she can't go any higher than B tier just because she's not in the game enough. In 5th place, I've got Coleman Drisco. Coleman Drisco is kind of this overarching bad guy. He's not really the main bad guy, but he's like the secondary bad guy for the entire game. And I think that's really what has to put him up here higher, especially with Dutch hating him so much. I think that really is just what brings his character to life. He's just this guy that Dutch hates so much and needs to see killed. And eventually they do see him killed, and Dutch, Sadie, and Arthur kind of all risk their lives going back into Saint Denis to just see him killed, which I think is a really interesting idea, and it really works well to build Colm's character. He's just this terrible guy, and just hearing all the bad things he's done, it's like Colm is just this terrible antagonistic being, and the similarities between him and Dutch and how they kind of operate and the differences between them, I feel like really builds Colm's character. He doesn't really have that much in terms of like actually doing stuff himself, but the fact that he's this cold, cunning character, and Dutch is kind of the same thing, but Dutch is more about family and is like a cult-like figure. I think it works well to build Colm's character and show the differences between them and have them kind of as a compare and contrast thing where they juxtapose each other's, meanings and ideals and everything like that. So I have to put Coleman A tier, but it really just works with him and Dutch. If there's no Dutch in this story, there's no Coleman Drisco. In 4th place, I've got Leviticus Cornwall. Cornwall isn't really a super fleshed out character, but I just love everything they did with Cornwall here. He's just this really demonic and I guess bad person. I don't even say demonic is a good word for it, but he's just a terrible person. He's a robber baron. He just kind of destroys everything around him, does the worst to people around him. He just wants to make more and more and more money. You can see it like in New Hanover, there's an oil well that's like destroyed, and you can tell like Cornwall was the one who destroyed it, and he like hired some killers to take him out. And also just the whole thing they did with the Wapiti Indians. It's just really interesting to see like a just truly terrible character in Red Dead Redemption 2. And while I think like Micah is also in a similar way, I think Cornwall is really the only true terrible character in the entire game. He just does everything to enrich himself. And I think that works well because Dutch is like the exact opposite. He's like a communist guy and Cornwall's the capitalist guy. And Dutch just wants to smash through all of Cornwall's ideals. And I think while Cornwall only makes like 2 appearances in the entire game, he's a much like badder figure. And he kind of holds this weight over the entire game. It's always like, oh my God, you're doing this to Cornwall. Do you know you can't mess with Cornwall the entire game? And every character, it seems like, is scared of Cornwall. You talk to the people and think it's like, bro, you cannot be doing this to Leviticus Cornwall. He's going to come down with the fury. And I mean, he eventually employs the Pinkertons, and I feel like they build an even better story there. But Cornwall is just this overall antagonistic force that really just is the opposite of Dutch's ideals. And I feel like it works really well to further the game forward. And while he definitely plays a big role in Chapter 2, he kind of plays a less big role the rest of the game, but I still feel like he's this big antagonistic force, and you want to see him dead. And then when Dutch eventually does kill him, you don't want to see him dead because the way Dutch does it is such a stupid idea, and I don't know. It's just, I love the way they use Cornwall's character in this game. I think he has to be an A-tier character no matter what, and an A-tier antagonist. In third place, I've got Agent Milton. Agent Milton is kind of a weird antagonist because he is a bad guy, especially when you compare him to the Van der Linde gang. But everything he does is lawful. He's a policeman, and he really just wants to help the Van der Linde gang get out of there. Or like he just wants them to stop doing bad things so then he doesn't have to arrest them. He's actually like a nice guy, even though the way he does everything is so cunning, and like he tries to outsmart the Van der Linde gang, especially when they don't accept his plea deals. And like Arthur could have easily turned in Dutch at the beginning, but he didn't. And Milton is this guy who just wants to do everything the right way, and he wants to get rid of all these killers, but he's not like Ross where he's just a super psychopathic person and just wants to take out everything that's bad in the world. He's giving people the chance to go away, but since the Van der Linde gang doesn't go away, he has to eventually endanger them. And he tries to take out Dutch. He tries to take out Arthur. You know, he can't, but I think the way that Milton really operated was he was just this bad guy, but he was just a good guy doing bad things, and he used the necessary evil to take out the Van der Linde gang. And while it didn't work, and I think some of the ways he did it were really bad, like kidnapping Abigail here, but I think the way he was doing it was all, in his mind, a necessary evil to take out the Van der Linde gang, and he wasn't doing anything like super bad to try and take them out. And I don't know, I just love the way that Milton worked, and while he's totally an antagonistic character, he really was just trying to be a nice guy to the Van der Linde gang and tried to let them off nicely before actually eventually having to go to more drastic measures. So I'm also going to put him in A tier, but he's at the very, very top of A tier. In second place, I have Micah Bell. Micah Bell is really just a kind of destructive force. I don't think he's really an antagonist in the game. I know he just wants to get his money. I think he would have left the Van der Linde gang a lot earlier if he just got the Blackwater money. I think he would have left. He would have done his thing. And I think that's really the whole Van der Linde gang's mystery is like, if they got the Blackwater money, would they have left for Tahiti? What would they have done with the Blackwater money if they got it early and if it had been an actual success? I don't know, but Micah is kind of just this destructive force after that. He just wants to get the money. He wants to get some big heist and then keep going for the big heist because, I don't know, he just wants to keep getting more money. And then he just becomes this destructive force trying to get in the way of Arthur and Dutch. And I feel like that just becomes him as an antagonist. And I think he's really well thought out because he doesn't seem like this bad guy. You can clearly tell he's a bad guy, but he's so well written, where everything he does seems cool and calculated, and that's why Dutch doesn't understand that everything he's doing is bad for the gang. And also, he just tries to do bigger and bigger and bigger heists, which really work to be like, Micah isn't the bad guy. He's really just a guy who wants to make everything bigger and better and always wants to, he's like a gambler. He always wants to hit that bigger jackpot every time, and it really just hurts the rest of the gang. But for him, it's something he needs. He's just this explosive personality that, it works for him, but everyone else, it doesn't really work for, in my opinion. And I just think Micah is super well written as a character. Eventually, he does become the rat and is like a really bad antagonist in that way, but he just wants to save his own hide. He's a survivor, Morgan. He's a survivor. He just wants to save himself, and that's the main thing for Micah. And that's why I think he's so well written as an antagonist. He wants to do these bigger and better things, but he also wants to save his own hide, and he wants to save himself. And that's just why Micah is an amazing character. He's super well written. You can clearly see his ambitions. He doesn't want to destroy the gang. He just wants to get the most out of it for himself. And the most out of it is going to getting him up to that second place instead of Arthur, and really just becoming the main guy in the gang while hitting these really big heists with Dutch. In first place, in rounding out the S tier, we have Dutch van der Linde. Of course, is the best antagonist in the entire game. He doesn't really seem like an antagonist for a lot of the game until Angelo Bronte's Mansion, where I feel like he turns from someone that's a really good character to someone that's kind of has some bad morals, and then you can clearly see him kind of spiraling off the end in the end. But I also think he's really similar to Micah, where he has this destructive personality as well. He always wants to do these bigger and better missions and always wants to get these bigger and better heists. And even if he could have gone to Tahiti, I don't think Dutch would have, because again, with Micah, he always wants to do these bigger and better things and always wants to make more and more money. And that's why I think him and Micah's personalities work so well. And also I think Dutch was just stuck on his morals. He always wanted to be this like communist guy where he would take from the big and the rich, the Cornwalls in this case, and give to the poor. And I think that's what he wanted with his whole gang, where he and Arthur and Hosea, they'd all do the money, they'd all get the money, and they'd provide for everyone else. He wanted to be this cult-like figure. And I just think the way Dutch is written is so well written, and especially when you just compare it to Red Dead Redemption 1, where you see the glimpses of this character. He's just super outlandish and like flamboyant and just charismatic, and I feel like it perfectly contrasts with his character in Red Dead Redemption 2, where he's the same guy, but you can see how he goes from just this charismatic kind of cult leader to being this explosive personality that you see in Red Dead Redemption 1. I just think it works so well with Dutch, and he's just such a great character here. You can see his ambitions, you can see his morals. He always wants to take from the rich, the Cornwalls of the world, but he wants to do it in a way where it really makes an explosion, where it kind of starts a chain reaction. I feel like it's a really close comparison to someone like Vladimir Lenin, where he just wanted to break down the whole system and have these communist ways. I just think Dutch is so well written in that way that he has to be an S tier antagonist, and it's just one of the best antagonists ever because of the way he's written and because his morals don't seem that bad. Just the way he goes about them are always really bad, and he always takes advantage of other people for his own good. And that rounds out my full Red Dead Redemption 2 antagonist tier list. Let me know what you guys would change in the comments, and then I'll comment with you, tell you why I think this way. And if you guys do like videos like this, subscribe, because I'm having videos like this every single day.